Well, thanks very much, Audrey, and welcome everybody this afternoon. We finally have some sunshine after a number of days of rain here in New York region. My name is Harry French. I am the program manager of the ClimateWise Business Network here at the Windfall Ecology Center. You've already had an opportunity to meet my colleague, Audrey Baines, who will not only act as the technical coordinator for us today, but will be involved in facilitation of some of the sessions as we move on. Go to the next slide, please, Audrey. Our topic today, maybe I actually jumped it ahead. There's too much. Sorry, I'm sorry,
there
Don.
You go.
My apologies. Just all the stuff in front of us. Our topic today, as Audrey introduced, is Green Leases, how to achieve cost savings and sustainability goals. This is the third in a series of informative webinars targeted at business tenants and commercial buildings. The commercial real estate sector in New York region, in fact, the GHTA, provides the workplace locations for a significant number of businesses. These are businesses who lease space for their office, warehousing, or distribution facilities. They are industrial condominiums or retail shopping venues. More than likely, they are SMEs with customer-facing or B2B relationships. They are often isolated from other businesses in their buildings, yet they share common space and utility infrastructure. Why are we focused on this segment? Because we think they've been left out of the opportunity to take action on climate change, because they have the most to gain by their customers and suppliers in being recognized for the climate action efforts, and because they are pivotal in their position to influence their building property owners in the adoption of practices that contributed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. What they need and what we're going to provide is a roadmap to greenhouse gas emission reductions, including how your business can benefit by understanding the critical signposts as you move towards your recognition destination for their sustainability efforts. And so this is one of the signposts, the importance of green leases to achieve cost savings, sustainability goals, and both for you and the landlords. I'm on slide 3. We're really thrilled today to have Emily Victoria Neal, who's manager of ESG and sustainability with Epic Investment Services, as well as Michael Brooks, who is CEO of RealPac. Audrey will introduce our panelists, or they'll introduce themselves later in more detail. For the next slide, please. Who are we? We are the ClimateWise Business Network, who run the ClimateWise Building Challenge in New York region. The challenge is a friendly awards and recognition competition created to reduce greenhouse emissions and reduce greenhouse gas emissions in New York region through building collaboration, education, and innovation. The competition is free of charge and open to building owners, landlords, and tenants and managers who want to join the fight to combat climate change. Windfall Ecology Center the ClimateWise Building Challenge is a program supported by the Windfall Ecology Center. Windfall Ecology Center is a not-for-profit enterprise dedicated to building sustainable communities. Windfall has served the York Region community for over 20 years. The center's activities focus on empowering communities to create lasting wealth in a carbon-constrained 21st century. Go to the next slide, please. Again, the webinar uses the metaphor of a roadmap. We are on a journey. Each webinar is a signpost in the journey, pointing our listeners in the right direction and taking action on climate change. The end of the journey is the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and the recognition of businesses for taking action on climate change. Next slide, please. What is it we want to accomplish today? There are a number of key topics. We want to talk about the problems with gross and net leases, how to negotiate a green lease with your landlord, and to assess if a green lease is right for your business. Next slide, please. I'm happy now to turn the moderation of the webinar over to my colleague Audrey Baines to introduce the speakers, and Audrey will guide us through a facilitated discussion designed to maximize your ability to set up a collaborative relationship between tenants and landlords using green leases. Audrey?
Thank you, Harry. We now will have our speakers introduce themselves. And Emily, if you'd like to go first.
Sure, thank you so much. It's a great honor to be here today. My name is Emily Victoria Neild, and I'm the manager of ESG and sustainability at Epic Investment Services. We are proud to have numerous properties in the York region and to help our tenants and our clients achieve their goals through mutual collaboration and to ensure that sustainability is always top of mind, especially as we begin to decarbonize our portfolio. And a key aspect in decarbonizing is making sure we're working with the tenants, and a great tool to ensure that we have that open dialogue with transparency of each other's goals is through green leases. And I am new to this space, but I'm very eager to dive more into it as I've been learning more about green leases and how we can get the most out of them, so both the landlord and the tenant benefit. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. And over to you, Michael.
Thanks. Thanks and good afternoon, everybody. And it's a pleasure also to be here today. I won't reread my bio, but the first green lease in North America was written by RealPAC in 2009. I wrote it. I went to Australia in 2006 when they were giving them out like candy. Some of you will remember 2006. That's the year that Inconvenient Truth came out with Al Gore. Realizing that I had missed the boat on something critical for our industry, I did a bit of a tour and built the first green lease in North America in 2009. We've done several iterations of it. We just did a major revision to it in the last year with outside counsel, again, to bring it totally up to date. And for myself, I'm a former career commercial real estate lawyer. I've negotiated every lease type, landlord and tenant side, for every asset class there is, so many times over that I got bored to death and decided to join RealPAC. And I've been here part-time, then full-time since 1997. So sustainability is absolutely top of mind for our organization. And I can tell you that it's top of mind for all of our members, like Emily's company at Epic. And so with that, I'll turn it back to you, Audrey.
Thank you, Michael. All right, and we shall begin now. So, why do we need green leases? Well, a little bit has been said by Michael there, where it's really about better leasing practices to work toward energy efficient investments. And so what is the role of the landlord and the tenant? Well, as an example, pandemic gave us many examples. You know, the landlord has to hardwire the lights to stay on and the heating and cooling, even if the space is unoccupied. And that was demonstrated very well in the last 2 years. So now we realize that there is a lot of room for improvement there. And that's about the relationship between the tenant and the building owner. So Emily, I'm going to ask you to speak first. How has COVID-19 impacted considerations for green leases? And if so, how?
Well, it definitely has impacted it. COVID-19 has changed everything. So 5-10 years ago, green leases were more around energy efficiency and waste reduction, which today, these provisions are now standard practices in leases. But what we noticed with COVID-19 is that we're starting to see a shift and more people wanting to know more about health and well-being. We're starting to see people make requests in their lease, such as having a certain standard of MERV filters, like MERV 13 being requested as we keep going forward. We're starting to see they want to know, Epic, we always do indoor air quality audits on an annual basis, but tenants are wanting to see these reports. They want more transparency. And that's a big part of these green leases, is making sure that we're still balancing health and well-being as people begin to return to the office, and along with energy efficiency and waste reduction and water efficiency, all the standard practices of the green lease, and ensuring that those two really work together as we continue to move forward.
Thank you, Emily. And Michael, your comments. Oh, you're on mute, Michael.
Always somebody who does that on every and every Zoom call. And this time it's usually I'm calling them out, but this time it's me. Yeah, I would say yeah, the Green Lease, and I've just posted in the chat function a copy of our latest Green Lease. It's a free download in Word, including black lines back to the prior versions. The Schedule E of that Green Lease really is where we detail what's contents of a Green Lease, and it's not just, it certainly is indoor air quality, but it's water consumption, it's energy consumption, it's carbon, it's hazardous chemicals brought into tenants' premises, it's the use of materials in tenants' premises and the building generally. So it's a very aspirational document, and it is a good platform for shared goals between a tenant and a landlord. And maybe I'll just leave it at that. Actually, maybe I'd add one more thing. For a lot of our members, sustainability kind of got moved to the back burner for a short period of time during the pandemic because disease tech became the item, touchless everything, and their focus changed for a short period of time, but now it's definitely back full speed on carbon reduction, on net zero, and all of the other elements that we've discussed.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so it's really broadened the conversation. Pandemic, I guess. Yeah. Okay. So again, timely, very timely with pandemic, but also timely with the storm on the horizon of climate action really coming down hard and creating situations where building owners are becoming faced with the possibility of mandatory data collection on their energy use and their GHG gases and transparency about that. So what we're talking about here is being accountable for your building, which is great. And how do we, this is how we shift in how we share responsibilities through collaboration with our tenants. So in that situation, how does a Green Lease address the ability to shift to this new reality? Michael, why don't you answer first?
Yeah, I guess we could focus on some of the sub-elements of that new reality. Yesterday was a bit of a milestone. Yesterday, the CO2 equivalent in our global atmosphere hit 420 parts per million. Why is that relevant? That's 50% higher than the pre-industrial revolution number, which is around 280. So that's how much mankind has bumped CO2 equivalent in the atmosphere. We're up 50%. So it's every day that goes by, controlling our carbon emissions becomes more and more important. And many analogize to a bathtub effect. We're just pouring the equivalent of CO2 into a bathtub, and it doesn't go down. It just keeps on going up and up in that bathtub. So it's a very critical issue, and both landlords and tenants can affect that. Tenants through plug load and through pushing the landlord to do more, to be better, to build a better building, to renovate a better building, to convert off of natural gas, to lower energy consumption. It's a partnership in achieving that goal. Emily, your thoughts?
Thank you.
I'm going to echo a lot of what Michael just said. The beautiful aspect of Green Leases is that it brings transparency and alignment between landlords and the tenants in order to achieve that goal of having your buildings to be as sustainable as possible. One thing that we've been noticing is it's coming down from a variety of people. It's coming from the owners of the buildings, and it's coming from these large corporations who are occupying the buildings. So we're noticing that when there's a major tenant in a building, like a Canadian Tire or an IKEA, a huge company, or HSBC, a big bank, when these companies are starting to set their own internal targets, they want to ensure that they are occupying buildings that will align with these targets, especially if they are externally reporting to places like TCFD, Task Force on Climate and Financial Disclosure, or their own internal sustainability reporting for their stakeholders. They're starting to choose buildings that actually have green leases. And it's becoming more attractive as a landlord to offer those green leases in advance, so that way it's not a requirement and you don't want the tenant chasing you. You'd rather be like, okay, we already have these standards and procedures in place. Here's the Green Lease standard, and we are willing to work with you to achieve your goals. For example, we have a large property in Calgary. Canadian Tire is the large tenant there. And we're currently working with them to try and get solar panels on the site. And this was a tenant-led initiative. And we are more than happy to build this into their upcoming lease renewal as we move forward to ensure that we can start switching off from the grid of Alberta, which is a little bit more coal heavy, to solar panels, which are a lot more easier for the environment as we get to decarbonize.
That is a great story, Emily. I love hearing things like that. And let's not forget that these large companies have their logos on the outside of the building, not the building owner. It's their identity that's impacted. So that's a fantastic story. Thank you. All right, now we're on to a little bit of a summary of the role of green leases. And Emily, I'd love you to walk us through these next few slides, please.
Yes, of course. So I know we really started to dive in to green leases right off the get-go, but I thought it'd be great if we just took a step back and reviewed what green leases are. So we know that leases are that relationship between the tenant and the landlord, and it just outlines everything that's possible between them in all the various arrangements. Now, we have green leases, and I'm going to be honest, RealPAC has been amazing. They've been setting out standards, but there's not one size fit all when it comes to green leases. It's something that has to be flexible, that has to be created with your tenant and with the owner of the building to make sure that you're meeting your joint goals. So that's one aspect of the green lease. And at Epic, we make sure that we have our green leases set up so that way we can improve tenant relations, reduce operating costs, and of course, drive value for the building owners. Now, when we go on, would you mind, Audrey, just flipping the slide? Thank you. Now, when it comes to actually defining a green lease, it's just like those series of provisions that can be inserted into the types of leases that we already use. And these provisions enable owners and occupiers of buildings to work together to reduce the environmental impact of the buildings that they occupy and to improve sustainability. So we can introduce provisions such as reducing carbon emissions, compliance with energy efficiency programs, waste reduction strategy, green transport measures. We see a variety of things in these green leases. But at the end of the day, when it comes to a green lease, one of the most important things is just making sure that we are sharing the joint goals. They need to reflect the commitments of both parties to reduce energy consumption, lower cost, etc. And we want to also make sure that we are encouraging sustainable practices from both a landlord and a tenant. So we are now seeing increased provisions in our leases for a mandatory number of electric vehicle charging stations and what type of charging stations that need to be put into place. Especially as tenants are beginning to return to the office, we have found that has been really popping up. That's been one of the new requests when it comes to tenant renewals is EV charging stations. And we want to make sure that we are removing any disincentives as we continue to make our green leases on the market and just making sure that we have all the tools and support available for the tenants. So when we have fit outs, for example, we're providing them resources of environmentally friendly materials or stating that appliances have to be Energy Star aligned in order to be energy efficient. So can we go to the next slide? Thank you. One thing about green leases is I always like to say there are shades of green leases. You can have a light green lease, a light color shade, or you can go to a dark green shade lease. So many of the green leases that we know are in this light green category, so like a base level green lease. And in that, you just really set your sustainability objective or intent. And you can really get to a more advanced green lease as we begin to add more provisions into these lease standards or more of these clauses. We can make them binding, which means it's a legal requirement, or we can make it aspirational, which means that there's a mutual intention between both parties. There are different ways in which we can frame the provisions. They can be part of the main lease themselves, or they can be part of the appendix. I find sometimes it's a little bit easier to modify the appendix when we work with various tenants if we're using the same standard lease for multiple clients as we go forward. Now, when we come to the shades of the green leases, one of the easiest things to implement is stating your objective and your intent. Then from there, we often see that from both parties, it's a requirement to report data on both ends. In industrial, we don't always control the utility consumption on site. So we often make that a clause in the leases that the tenant will provide their utility data to us. And that I would consider as part of your base level green lease. We can make things more advanced, saying that we can recover capital costs for sustainability initiatives through operating cost. That way we can kind of reduce that split incentive barrier and make sure that everyone is winning at the end of the day. We'll be talking more about that later on in the webinar. We can use restrictions to ensure that both parties are complying with what we are setting out to do. So for example, we have many tenants who are making these goals to become net zero. We can put restrictions in place saying, okay, our building's going to be net zero by X, Y, and Z. This is the pathway that we're going to be achieving this. We're going to be procuring RECs for this property. We are starting to electrify where we can. And then lastly, you can go and make it really advanced green lease by putting monitoring and reporting requirements in it, ensuring that both parties are frequently communicating with one another about the goals, not just that, but what they are actually consuming on site, and that you're keeping track of your targets. One of my favorite sayings is you can't manage what you don't measure. So when it comes to any green lease, just making sure that you have the data at the very beginning, because from then you can set your targets to start to decarbonize. That's it in a snapshot.
Yeah.
Shades of green leasing.
That's what we do at Climate Wise Building Challenge. We help everyone manage their benchmarking. We don't do all those vast negotiations that you're talking about. That must take quite a bit of time between the two parties. And we do have a slide later on that's going to talk a little bit more about that. Michael, did you want to comment on this slide before we move on?
No, I mean, the difference between Emily and myself is that Emily's in the trenches doing these deals with her asset managers day in and day out. So it's actually great to hear this structuring that she's doing. And yeah, I'm kind of the industry guy who is trying to provide resources to Emily and her peers and make sure they're best in class all the time.
Yeah. Well, that's great. I
great.
just learned something new too. Thank you, Michael.
And who knows, maybe one day it will be the standard green leases. I know in France right now, it's actually mandatory for all large commercial leases to be a green lease. Maybe soon that will be the same in Canada. Who knows?
Oh, I would think so. Yeah, that's great news. Always something to aspire to. So to come back to types of leases, maybe we should understand better what is not a green lease, meaning what is a gross lease and what is a net lease. Because those are the typical leases of the past, we're going to say, that we're moving from and moving to green leases. So if you look at the slide here, I don't need to read the bullet points, but basically a gross lease is, the building owner manages everything from operations and maintenance and utilities and everything, and there's a base rent. That's pretty standard. In a net lease, the tenant begins to take responsibility for things like the property taxes, insurance, and maintenance to a large degree. But there are complexities to a net lease. Again, everything has to be written out and agreed to. I'm sure there's still a lot of negotiation there. So, and in a green lease, there is a cost sharing, but it's about something different, meaning the intention of an energy efficiency investment and how that capital cost can come back to both parties. The benefits of that investment comes back to both parties. And so the owner's investment is that it increases the desirability of tenants to be in their building, which Emily already spoke to, which is a super valid point, really important. And then the tenants benefit because as time goes on after this capital cost, they do see a reduction in their operating costs. So what is the non-financial goal is really about the plug load, as Michael talked about. The behavioral aspect that contribute to efficiencies. It's about reducing the waste, reducing the energy usage, understanding what it means to reduce your carbon emissions, even your carbon input in the materials that you use, how you turn on and off your lights, is there building automation involved? And on top of that, I think sometimes there's monitors placed in the building so that the tenants have a direct connection to understanding how they are impacting their energy use immediately through the monitors, which is really great. So if Michael, you could start off commenting on this one, because it appears to me that you would have had to define the benefits of a green lease for many, many years now, since you did the initial green lease. So what is the benefit, what was the benefit associated with gross and net versus green that you had to overcome that challenge when you began doing green leases?
Yeah, so what I would say is that they're not mutually exclusive. For most of us, when we think of a gross lease, we think of an apartment lease. That's a gross lease. Maybe utilities are extra, but everything's included in that monthly rent if you're renting an apartment. That's a classic gross lease. A net lease is what is a lease divided up into a base rent. And then separate from that are all the costs that potentially are subject to inflation. Property taxes, insurance, and maintenance you've mentioned here, but maintenance, repairs, upgrade, new roof. For capital items, and this is often the most contentious part of lease negotiations, when a landlord makes a major capital repair to a building, is all of that cost charged in 1 year? Is it amortized? How long is it amortized over? And many tenants and landlords will have lengthy discussions over that, because of course the tenant doesn't want to be surprised by a major retrofit or a major recommissioning or a major capex cost. So net leases come in all varieties and sizes. And I think technically you could make a gross lease a green lease. I think you could make a net lease a green lease. The issue is going to come down to enforcement. And we've asked this question of ourselves since 2009, since our first green lease. Do we make these terms mandatory such that if you breach them, it's a default of the lease? Or are these soft goals where they're aspirational such that if the tenant doesn't meet its targets or the landlord doesn't, it's just, well, we tried, it's not a breach of the lease. And for me, and hopefully Emily will correct me if she's saying otherwise, it's generally aspirational. I think parties are still uncomfortable making it a default under the lease. But Harry, if you'll give me time for a short story, and hopefully I've got more than 30 seconds. When I first started, am I okay for time, Harry?
Go ahead.
Okay. So when I started, I told you my journey started in 2006, an inconvenient truth. And I did what all responsible people would do. I turned to Mr. Google. Find me the most sustainable company in the world. Find me the most sustainable building in the world. On the sustainable companies, there was something called the Dow Jones World Sustainability Index that had a real estate sub-index. There were 10 companies on that most sustainability list. 4 were from Europe, 6 were from Australia. None in North America, 0. Most sustainable building in the world. They sent me to a building in Melbourne, Australia. So I did what all responsible CEOs would do. I got on a plane. I said, I'm going to go meet those 6 most sustainable company CEOs, and I'm going to go see that building. I went to see this building in Melbourne. I had a tour by the property manager, and it was a small 3-story office building with a nice little stream and plants running down the middle of it in an atrium. And he's giving me a tour, and he's showing me various tenants, and a lot of them are kind of NGOs, and charitable companies and stuff. And we finally got to one that's a law firm. And I said, oh, I see you have law firms in here as well. And he says, yeah, but they're leaving. I said, oh, is their lease up? He says, no, we're kicking them out. What do you mean you're kicking out your law firm tenant? Well, they exceeded their energy budget 2 months in a row, and that's a default in their lease. And I said, are you kidding me? That's rental income. How can you possibly be kicking out a tenant that's paying you rent? And he looked at me in the eye and he said, Mike, we have a waiting list of tenants to get in this building. I've never forgotten that story because it tells you about the demand side of this. It's not just about rent. It's about people who really want to be, it's about branding. It's about branding both for the tenants and the landlords. So I probably said enough and exceeded my time, Harry, but I thought that was a good story.
It's a great story. Emily, would you like to have a short comment?
That is a fantastic example that Michael just shared. And I'm really glad that he did, because we are now, I just love that story. It's just so much how there is a waiting list. And that really goes to show something we're going to be talking about a little bit later on, how green leases benefit both parties. When you are operating a green building, you are able to charge a little bit more of a rent premium, but tenants are able to reduce their costs at the same time because they have less in terms of energy that they are paying towards. So it really is that great balance. And I just want to add that any lease can become a green lease with the right provisions in place. And as Michael was saying earlier, I know I wanted my input on one thing. Most of these things, we do not have those firm binding clauses like they do at some of these Australian companies. They are aspirational at this point, but I will say this, in the future, as governments are making transitions in the market, such as the City of Toronto and their net zero programming, we will have to start making some of these clauses a little bit more binding so that way we can meet regulatory requirements. Similar to what's happening in New York City right now, in which they're making sure that the properties have to decarbonize, and we have to ensure that the tenants are working towards that decarbonization goal along with the owners of the building. So if there's regulatory requirements coming out, then green leases are going to have to become more binding as opposed to aspirational.
Good point. There's the storm on the horizon. All right. So whenever you Google, and I was learning about green leases, so I was talking to Mr. Google a lot, you hear a lot about the split incentive barrier. And so tenants are paying for energy usage, building owners responsible for capital improvements. Where do we find this balance between the two? Emily, you're in the trenches, you're working with people, trying to get a positive relationship happening. You know, green leases, really, bottom line is, as you say, any lease can become a green lease because it equals collaboration of shared objectives. So, Emily, if you would like to comment first on what are your insights to achieving consensus, carrot or stick?
Okay, so, well, in the past, we know that green leases, they really were about balancing financial incentives for sustainability improvements between the building owner and the tenant. Well, now I find that the conversation has shifted towards mutual value creation. Both tenant parties can benefit, but I know that you see typically that sometimes the tenants will pay for the energy use, but the building owner does the capital improvements. So when we can, we actually start shifting things away from capital costs to an operational cost where we can, which can then be recovered through the tenant, so through a tenant recoverable program. We also make sure that we are upfront with some of the big capital programs that are starting to come down the pipeline and letting them know that, well, while we can't amortize what we can, in some cases, if a tenant does want to be in this building and they are willing to pay a premium to be in this building because of the green incentives going on, we will be honest with them, be like, hey, here are the capital improvements that are coming up. We are looking to make our boilers electric in order to reduce carbon emissions, scope 1 carbon emissions, for example. I just find making sure that you have that honest dialogue is one of the best ways possible. And I have a little story to add on after Michael goes on to the carrot, stick, or question mark. We'll let him elaborate that.
There you go. Over to you, Michael.
Yeah, so I agree with all of Emily's points, and that mutual value creation piece is critical. The split incentive barrier, I think, is mischaracterized a little bit because their interests in the building are totally different. The tenant is a temporary resident. It's there for 3 or 5 or whoever X number of years before they move on. They need more, they need less, they're changing their location, whatever. But the owner has the long-term residual interest in the building, and so it has a higher need to control what happens in the building and its lifespan. So that's why I say that green leases tend to be paternalistic. The landlord is calling the shots. It's his, her, its property. They own it. So there's not really equal bargaining power as you might think in that, but there certainly is mutual value creation depending on what it is. There could be cost saving value, there could be brand value. We've talked about both of those. And there's maybe a third element too. I call this triad carrot, stick, or tambourine. Tambourine, what's the tambourine? It's neither a carrot or a stick, but it's something to engage the spirit of people in that building and try to build not just shared objective, but a bit of sense of community. One of the trends that we've seen in the last 10 years is tenant engagement. And it used to be with landlords and tenants that it was just, I don't want to talk to you, just send me the rent check at the end of the month. That's it. But now we see in many properties a landlord and tenant green committee, for example, where each tenant nominates a representative and they get together and they talk about, what's going on in the building. Give us some feedback. What do you like? What do you don't like? What do you think we should do here? What's the way forward? And that's really been a terrific new innovation to actually talk to your tenant. That's the tambourine. That's one of the tambourine parts of this, just engaging with your tenants and talking to them, communication, thinking about shared programs as well. So that's what I would say about that, building a community.
I love it. That's wonderful. And we'll be talking to Harry French will be talking about the amazing tenant engagement program that ClimateWise is introducing into the community, building the tenant community. Emily, your story, can you?
Yes. So earlier on, I was talking about this one large building that we had in Calgary. Primary tenant is Canadian Tire, who is almost 85% of the property. So I just want to say about the tambourine, about the community spirit behind it. So when they wanted to start doing some of the solar, we were willing to work to actually put some of that charge back on them. But there was a smaller tenant in the building who started to protest. But we found that having an open discussion with us, the Canadian Tire and the smaller tenant, all in the same room as part of a green committee, we were able to really communicate the incentives that are going to be behind it. So it became less of you against us. It became a collective joint effort to initiate solar panels. I really find that the engagement piece is crucial. A lot of people are interested in it. You just have to really explain how it benefits them. People are scared of what they don't know. So
right.
if you can do consistent and persistent communication and making sure that you're honest on all fronts, people are a lot more willing to accept sustainable measures going forward.
That is a great story. And it really just goes to show you that transparency builds trust. Yeah, wonderful. All right, we are on to collaborative relationship building. And as you know, I mean, this has been the core of our conversation so far. So now just into a few technical details about incentivizing and voluntary action. There's no enforcing at this time, but as you mentioned earlier, Emily, it might have to come. And collaborate to future-proof your business, when that regulation starts to happen. So we've talked about both parties having clear sustainability goals. This is something I found on Mr. Google, Emily, about establishing the green language used to define the lease, maybe, so everyone is talking the same language. And then also the tenant engagement programs, as you mentioned, Michael, are really coming out in this environment now. And it's about sub-metering and data sharing, about utilities and green tenant build-outs, as you mentioned, Emily. So Emily, you seem to be in the trenches more, and so you might be able to answer this question a little more easily. But the challenges of achieving an effective green lease. We probably have to be somewhat brief. Harry's coming on because he's going to tell us we've got 3 minutes left before we move into the next section. So 30 seconds, Emily. Can you give us a little comment?
Biggest challenge is reducing risk when it comes to certain schedules in a green lease, especially if you're working on an industrial site and it's a company that has chemicals, making sure that we are mitigating the risk for both parties and that there's insurance in place and remediation actions that are really to be followed up. That has always been one of the strongest pushbacks on green leases, I find, when we are dealing with any company that has chemicals. But we stand firm. We make sure that we do a phase 1 ESA before a tenant comes in. So that way we have a groundwork of what soil and the environment is at the moment. So soil samples, water samples. So we get that baseline. And so that way both tenants, both the tenant and the owner, are happy in that regard. So I will say industrial leases, chemicals can be tricky. As for a phase 1 ESA, so that way you can see where you're starting on to make sure that you're mitigating any risk going forward.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
30 seconds, biggest
That's
challenge.
great. Michael, can you do 30 seconds? Oh, you're on mute.
And I'm going to bank the 30 seconds and move on to the next one where I might have more
Okay.
comment.
Got it. So this slide, creation of a green lease, as well as this slide, which talks about, working through the negotiations. This slide deck will be a handout. It will be downloadable by everyone and anyone who has not joined the webinar. So in some ways, we can kind of skip through all this copy a little bit, Emily, and we can go to this really important one of the cycle and how, this is where you work in the trenches of constantly figuring out these negotiations. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. So going to that cycle, as I said, it was earlier, the shades of green of a green lease.
Yeah.
Easiest, lightest shade of green, your pale mint, is you set your sustainability objective or intent. One of the most common clauses that we see in this is tenants wanting their building to meet a certain green certification standard, such as this building shall maintain a LEED gold standard throughout the entire time that the tenant occupies the building, or a BOMA Best platinum standard, or that the building we're now starting to see health and well-being certifications enter the market. So just setting those objectives and intent up front.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Oh, okay. So Michael, RealPAC has a green lease package that's downloadable, and the link is on this page. And when people download this, they will go to that link. But could you tell us a little bit more about that resource?
Absolutely. Just checking to make sure I wasn't on mute again for the third time. And I've put the link to it directly in the chat for those of you on the line to click through. So as I mentioned, this green lease we built in 2009. We've upgraded many times, including a major upgrade last fall. I can tell you we've talked to a lot of our members who used this lease early in its creation. Some took the whole lease. The basic lease on which it was built was a best-in-class lease of the 6 biggest office landlords in the city of Toronto when it was put together. And we've certainly gone through and updated some of the non-green clauses in this last iteration from last year. But many, so some take it as a complete lease and saying, this is going to be my standard lease in my building, landlord from now on. Others use it as a clause bank. I'll tell you one more story, Harry, if you can give me some time. This is a short story. I know you're turning your head.
You don't have very much, Michael.
Okay, very quick story. So we started to see this lease being used immediately after 2009. And we put in a clause in this lease that said any carbon credits as a result of carbon emission reduction by the landlord will accrue to the landlord. It was at the time I was thinking, okay, this is just something, probably a throwaway clause. Then I was told by a lot of our members, it was the most hotly debated clause in the green lease. The fact that the landlord gets all the carbon credits and the tenant doesn't get some of them, even though they're participating in the reduction of energy usage. That's your story, Harry. Sorry for taking so long.
Yeah.
No, that's an important story because Harry's working very hard on his tenant engagement program. So there'll be more on that shortly.
Yeah.
With this page, I think we have heard a lot of benefits. I don't know that we need to talk about this one. I think everyone has gleaned an awful lot from the previous conversations. Everyone good to skip this one?
Yep, I'll just add in my favorite fact.
Okay.
The Institute for Market Transformation in the US, they actually estimated that green leases could help reduce utility bills by up to 22%. So it's a great return for tenants and owners. That's it. Fun fact.
You want a fun fact, Michael?
See, Emily's outthinking me again on this. I didn't have my fun fact. My fun facts were both downers, the CO2 equivalent, and the fact that Canada hasn't made a dent in its total carbon emissions in 15 years.
That is a problem. That's a sad fact, not a fun fact.
Yeah, sad fact.
All right. Have we got any questions in the chat?
Yeah. There's one that's come up here. And it's about what I'm going to talk about later on in a brief way, recognition. How do tenants get acknowledged for the contributions that they are doing in their building or that they might do in their buildings going forward under green leases? How do you recognize them for their efforts in taking action on climate change? Emily, want to start with that?
Okay. In the interest of time, I'm going to be very brief. One, we try to really highlight our tenants who are making a big impact. So in our annual sustainability report that Epic produces, if a tenant has gone above and beyond, we'd like to interview the tenant and have a case study on them showing how we work together to really achieve mutual goals. And then vice versa, we will also make sure that we provide all the data for them for their own internal sustainability reporting. So that way we can both get good public relations in that process. So we highlight each other in a shared mutual approach.
Okay, Michael, what are you seeing that the sector's doing? Sorry, Emily, are you not finished?
No, I just said that was just in terms of PR. There's so much more, but I'll little snippets.
Yeah, how do you recognize the tenant? Well, for most of our members, the tenants are also doing their own ESG reports, not just the landlord. So they are taking benefits from the landlord's data. For example, the fact that there may be a tenant in a LEED Platinum building, or that's a BOMA Best highly rated building, or that it's an Energy Star, 85 building. Those facts and those accreditations and proxies for green directly benefit the tenant, and they will often say, we're in a building that's X, because that's their profile and that's their brand.
Okay. I'm not seeing any more here, but in the sake of time, we'll have another spot later on, give people a chance to sort of reflect a little bit on what they're hearing here this afternoon. So if you want to just to move the next slide, Audrey.
Yeah, we'll have questions again at the end.
Yeah, we'll see, give people a chance to sort of think about that. We have another 10 minutes actually left. So this is our call to action, and I can't tell you how much we appreciate Emily and Michael's time today and their time over the last week or so working with us to develop this webinar for commercial building tenants and their owners. We need this message to go down to others, and we need a critical mass of organizations and businesses involved. And we've provided that opportunity for organizations in York Region through our Climate-Wise Building Challenge. This is an Ontario Trillium Funds sponsored, supported initiative that we have 3 years of an opportunity to work with and support York Region buildings owners and businesses in these buildings to reach energy and greenhouse gas reduction targets. And that will large part be done through introducing them to knowledge and information about what they can do, such as green leases. And in our last webinar, we talked a lot about regulatory and legislative changes that Emily mentioned as well. So we can support you through the Climate-Wise Building Challenge. Next slide, please, Emily. That's Emily. Audrey. So there's benefits that you could expect in being part of the challenge, certainly bottom line savings, access to information that you're hearing today from Emily and Michael and others that we've had in the past will help you stay on top of available incentives. Key to this in terms of medium-term benefits, attracting and retaining top-tier employees, because that's a key constraint, a key opportunity in today's labor-constrained market. Engaging employees is a critical part. We will help you develop a green team to engage the employees' intellect, understanding, on-the-ground knowledge of what it is they can do. And most important, you're part of a movement. The benefit is being part of a movement to take action on climate change in York Region. Next slide. All this leads to a destination on our journey, a destination of recognition, community recognition, business recognition, recognition to your customers and suppliers about your willingness to engage in taking climate action. So for building owners, we're partnered with BOMA in their Race to Reduce program. All the Climate-Wise Building Challenge winners will have the opportunity to escalate to the BOMA Crest Awards, which are taking place October 13th in 2022. Our event at the York Region Sustainability Awards, which we also conduct each year, will happen before that, where we'll recognize our buildings and businesses in York Region and the opportunity for them to escalate to the CREST Awards in October. Next slide, please, Audrey. The journey's end also includes recognition, and that's why I was happy to see the question in the chat earlier on. We are launching a pilot project in York Region where we are testing the marketability and feasibility of a tenant space recognition program. This is modeled very much on the Energy Star Portfolio Manager tenant space module in the US, and we have an understanding with our colleagues at Natural Resources Canada to bring the tenant space recognition program into Canada through a pilot project in York Region, hopefully by the spring of 2023. To do that, we need participants, both building owners and tenants, to participate in the pilot project so we can test some of the assumptions, establish the feasibility, and launch the program. So if you're interested in becoming part of that, please reach out to myself or Audrey in the coming days, weeks, and get involved in our tenant space recognition program. Next slide, please. This is, again, the third of 3 webinars we've been having on topics of valuable to building owners and commercial building tenants. We have another one coming up on June the 3rd, then in September, and then carrying on into October and November on various topics that build upon some of the past content that we've been hearing from some of our speakers. Next slide, please. We already have a number of participants in the Building Challenge, commercial and both municipal leaders within York Region. All of the York Region municipalities, including the Region of York, are part of our Building Challenge. We were happy to have Crown Property Management involved, 407 is involved, Honda Canada, Riverside Natural Foods, the maker of Made Good Bars, and we recently were very excited to announce that RBC is considering joining with their retail spaces in York Region. And this is in part invited to come to us through our partnership with the BOA Race to Reduce program. So there's good momentum happening. We need to build upon that momentum in the coming months. Next slide, please. So please join the challenge. The website will be on the slide deck when it's sent out to you. Just Google Climate-Wise Business Network or Windfall Ecology Center, and you'll see the information you need to join the challenge and take advantage of some of the opportunities that we present by way of the resources and networking that we offer through the Climate-Wise Building Challenge. I'm not seeing a lot more questions on the chat, Audrey, but I would invite Emily and Michael, perhaps in the few minutes we have left, if you'd like to have any sort of final comments in terms of your reflections on this session and what you might have taken away or what advice you might give some of the participants online today.
Well, first of all, thank you guys again for joining this session. And I really do hope that you learned a lot about green leases. My final word of advice is that any lease can be made into a green lease. Make sure that you clearly state your goals with your landlord and that you work together to achieve your mutual goals towards sustainability. If you want to go further, you always can. As I say, there's varying shades of green leases, and we always encourage those nice darker green leases in which we have set requirements for reporting frameworks.
And don't forget, there are some additional slides in the archives at the end of this deck that you'll get when you download it. So you can look up some of the details that Emily was able to skim the surface on. And Michael.
I think what I would say is, I mentioned that CO2 equivalent's up 50% globally, and that Canada's been flatlining on megatons of CO2 at 740 megatons annually since 2005. Like we're not bending that curve down. Buildings account for 35 to 40% of the CO2 emissions in this country, buildings. So the heat is going to be squarely on our sector, and we have to be seen, both tenants and landlords have to be seen to respond. The obligation is going to be on both of us. And we're starting to see more and more incentive programs coming out for those owners on this webinar to help them figure out what renovations, retrofits, recommissioning they need to do in their building to lower their carbon emissions. In fact, Emily, I was on a program last week with the City of Toronto who has a PACE program where you can make renovations to your building to lower its carbon emissions and have the cost of that be repaid over many years through your property tax bill. So and there's grant money available from more and more federal institutions, provincial. So this is coming, and it's just going to increase.
Great, thank you. I'll just close then, Audrey, if I can. I want to thank our speakers, Emily and Michael, on behalf of the Windfall Ecology Center Climate-Wise Business Network, myself, Harry French, and Audrey Baines for your participation today. We need to build a movement. You're part of that movement and part of that responsibility. So join the Climate-Wise Building Challenge. And at the end of this session as well, I want to remind you that, again, the deck will be available. We'll send it out to you. The recording will be available. You can go back and review some of the material. Those of you who came on late, if you would like to let us know through the chat how you heard about the webinar, we'd really appreciate it. Look out for more information for our June webinar and those happening in the fall. Thanks very much for your time. Thanks again, Emily and Michael, and we will see you at our next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.